Charles Schwab built this mansion in Manhattan and died penniless. Charles Schwab Mansion. Mornings along Riverside Drive in the early 20th century often began in a kind of quiet pride. Early sunlight reflected off the Hudson River, slipped through rows of bare winter trees, and settled on the massive limestone facades of the Upper West Side, where New York was redefining itself as the financial and industrial capital of the modern world. Within this setting stood a structure that was remarkable not only for its size or grandeur, but for what it represented: one man's near absolute belief in the power of money, of steel, and of limitless expansion. This was the Charles Schwab Mansion, once considered one of the largest private residences ever built in Manhattan. But this story does not begin with stone, Corinthian columns, or lavish halls. It begins with a nation in violent transition, an America where heavy industry reshaped not only the physical landscape, but the very meaning of success, honor, and wealth. Charles M. Schwab was not born into European-style aristocratic privilege, nor did he inherit a long-standing financial dynasty. He was a quintessential product of the American Gilded Age, an era in which men who could organize, persuade, and control resources could rise to the highest levels of power at a speed never before seen in human history. Schwab came of age in an America where steel was more than a building material, it was a symbol of national strength. He entered the industry with rare instinct and quickly distinguished himself as an exceptional executive at Carnegie Steel, before rising to lead United States Steel, the largest steel corporation in the world at the time. In the eyes of the public and the financial elite, Schwab embodied the future, a man capable of turning blast furnaces, rail lines, and steel plates into political power, social influence, and seemingly limitless wealth. It was at this very peak that Schwab made a decision of symbolic weight, a declaration in stone and steel of his place within New York's new social order. He would build a mansion not merely to live in, but to assert. Not in Newport, like the old elite. Not on the crowded Fifth Avenue, but on Riverside Drive, overlooking the Hudson, as though the entire commercial bloodstream of America flowed past his windows. The Charles Schwab Mansion was designed in the French Renaissance style, inspired by European chateaux, with an imposing facade, steeply pitched roofs, dozens of reception rooms, ballrooms, libraries, and spaces meant to host the most extravagant gatherings of New York's upper class. It was not simply a residence. It was a stage of power, where financiers, politicians, and industrialists met, and where decisions affecting millions of American workers were discussed beneath crystal chandeliers. At the time of its completion, the mansion was considered one of the most expensive private homes Manhattan had ever seen. In scale and extravagance, it rivaled, and in some cases surpassed, the palaces of Europe's old nobility. To Schwab, this was not blind display. It was his way of placing himself into history as a man who had conquered the heights of the industrial age. Yet even in that moment, while the stone walls were still new and the halls echoed with the footsteps of powerful guests, the first cracks of tragedy were quietly forming. History does not operate according to the logic of personal ambition. And the Gilded Age, for all its brilliance, always carried a darker side few dared to confront. The Charles Schwab Mansion, no matter how grand, could never be separated from the man who created it. And that man, despite his talent, confidence, and mastery of industrial systems, was not immune to the harsh forces of markets, politics, and personal choice. The question is not why Schwab built the mansion, but how a man who once stood at the peak of American finance could die nearly penniless. In the next part, the story will leave the mansion's glittering halls and move backward in time, tracing the path that carried Charles Schwab from a small town boy to America's steel king, to better understand the mindset, ambition, and decisions that shaped both his triumph and his collapse. From a small town boy to America's steel king. Before the name Charles Schwab became associated with grand limestone halls overlooking the Hudson, before the massive mansion on Riverside Drive stood as a symbol of absolute confidence, his life began in a far more modest place, modest in both setting and expectation. Schwab was born in 1862 in Williamsburg, Pennsylvania, into a family of no great wealth and no meaningful political or financial connections. His father worked in small-scale industry. His mother embodied the discipline and restraint of late 19th century American middle-class life. Nothing about the young boy's circumstances suggested he would one day become one of the most powerful figures in the global steel industry. Schwab's childhood unfolded within the slow, constrained rhythm of small industrial towns, places where the sound of machinery was constant, but opportunities for advancement were limited. He was not an exceptional student by academic standards. In fact, Schwab struggled in traditional schooling, particularly in subjects that required rote learning and strict classroom discipline. Yet it was precisely in this environment that a different kind of intelligence took shape: the ability to read people, to persuade them, and to organize work in practical, flexible, results-driven ways. It was a form of intelligence textbooks rarely rewarded, but one the industrial age desperately needed. At a young age, Schwab left the conventional educational path and sought opportunity in the rapidly expanding world of steel and railroads. He began at the lowest levels, observing how factories operated, how workers labored, and, most importantly, how managers made decisions. While many of his contemporaries viewed labor simply as a cost to be minimized, Schwab quickly recognized that productivity, loyalty, and morale could be shaped if leadership understood the psychology of workers. This perspective was rare in an industry known for its severity and indifference. The decisive turning point came when Schwab joined Carnegie Steel, the vast steel empire built by Andrew Carnegie, within a system that prized efficiency, profit, and expansion above all else. Schwab stood out almost immediately. He was neither a great inventor nor a brilliant engineer, but he was a connector. Schwab could speak to workers in their own language while persuading investors with a vision that extended beyond balance sheets. Carnegie, famously demanding in his choice of associates, quickly recognized Schwab's unusual value. Under Carnegie's patronage, Schwab advanced at an extraordinary pace. He was entrusted with the management of key plants, allowed to experiment with new organizational approaches, and, most critically, relied upon during moments when the American steel industry entered periods of intense competition. Schwab did more than increase output. He helped shape an image of steel as a modern, efficient industry capable of managing its own internal conflicts, at least in the short term. When Andrew Carnegie decided to sell Carnegie Steel, a move that led to the creation of United States Steel, the first corporation in the world valued at over $1 billion, Schwab became the nearly inevitable choice for leadership. He was placed at the center of a power structure without historical precedent, one in which steel not only built cities but shaped labor policy, politics, and America's position on the global stage. Still relatively young by the standards of the financial elite, Schwab now stood at a summit few could even imagine reaching. Yet it was here, amid enormous figures, closed-door meetings, and decisions with national consequences, that the seeds of instability began to take root. Schwab was a man of action, instinct, and personal conviction. The structure of United States Steel, however, demanded patience, discipline, and the ability to manage a massive system governed by rigid rules. Increasingly, Schwab felt constrained. The tension between the man and the institution became visible, even as the outward appearance of success remained intact. In the next part, the story will examine the moment Schwab stepped away from the most powerful position in American steel, and how he chose to reconstruct his identity through luxury, architecture, and a way of life that would grow increasingly detached from the financial realities quietly shifting beneath his feet. Absolute power, and the moment the steel throne was left behind. When Charles Schwab stood at the center of United States Steel, he was not merely running a corporation. He occupied the heart of a new structure of power, one in which heavy industry merged with politics, finance, and national ambition. In the early 20th century, steel was the backbone of modern America, shaping railroads, bridges, skyscrapers, and warships. To control steel in many ways was to control the pace of an entire nation's development. Schwab understood this deeply, and that understanding became both his greatest strength and his heaviest burden. Under Schwab's leadership, United States Steel expanded at an extraordinary pace. Mills ran without pause, production surged, and the company's influence extended beyond American borders. Schwab emerged as the public face of a new generation of industrial leaders, men unafraid to speak openly, to debate publicly, and to assert the role of industry in shaping America's future. Unlike many of his more reserved contemporaries, Schwab embraced visibility. He welcomed the spotlight and believed that his personal force was the engine driving the massive organization behind him. But that very style soon collided with the realities of a corporate empire built not for individual expression, but for stability. United States Steel was no longer the personal arena Carnegie Steel had once been. It was a complex system dominated by banks, investors, and cautious financial interests. Every major decision now required balance: profit against market stability, growth against the fear of financial panic. Schwab, driven by instinct and momentum, increasingly found himself at odds with a structure that valued restraint over boldness. The tension reached a breaking point as Schwab began to criticize the very governance system of the corporation he led. Through speeches, interviews, and private arguments, he revealed a growing frustration with rules he believed suffocated initiative. To the major banks and financial powers of Wall Street, this was unacceptable. In an era that prized order above all else, Schwab's powerful personality came to be seen as a liability rather than an asset. Schwab's departure from United States Steel did not unfold as a public collapse, but as a series of quiet negotiations and strategic compromises. He left with his reputation largely intact, with immense personal wealth by the standards of the time, and with the confidence that he could succeed again on his own terms. To the public, this was not a fall, but a transition. History, however, rarely reveals its full meaning in the moment. Once removed from the steel throne, Schwab confronted a question few men at his level ever had to face honestly. Who was he without the machinery of a vast industrial empire behind him? For Schwab, the answer was not retreat or restraint. Instead, he chose expansion of a different kind, amplifying his personal image through luxury, social presence, and, most significantly, architecture. In this vacuum of institutional power, the idea of a grand Manhattan mansion began to take shape. The house Schwab envisioned was not meant merely as a residence. It was a declaration that he still belonged among the highest ranks of power, that his exit from United States Steel was not an ending, but a liberation. Schwab believed he could stand outside rigid structures and retain influence. What he underestimated was how quietly, yet decisively, The economic and social landscape beneath him was beginning to change. In the next part, the story will follow Schwab as he builds his Manhattan mansion, where money, prestige, and architecture combine into a magnificent symbol, and where the first signs of financial risk begin to surface beneath the grandeur. The mansion as a declaration of power. When Charles Schwab began to bring his Manhattan mansion into reality, New York was entering an era in which architecture was no longer simply about shelter. It had become a language of power. The city, once built by merchants and traders, was now a stage where industrial titans competed not only through profits, but through the marks they left on the skyline. Schwab understood this clearly. He did not want a large house. He wanted a symbol. The site he chose stood along Riverside Drive, overlooking the Hudson River, a location removed from the congestion of Midtown, yet close enough to assert presence within New York's emerging center of power. From this vantage point, the river itself served as a living metaphor for commerce, steel, and the flow of goods that had carried Schwab to the peak of success. The choice was no accident. Every window and balcony was positioned to remind visitors that the owner of this mansion had once commanded the industrial heartbeat of the nation. Schwab commissioned architects working in the Beaux Arts and French Renaissance traditions, styles long associated with royal authority and European aristocracy. In a country that prided itself on democracy and social mobility, the choice carried a quiet provocation. It signaled that Schwab no longer saw himself merely as a successful businessman, but as the equal of old-world dynasties, a new kind of nobility forged from steel and free markets. Construction moved forward at a pace and cost that astonished contemporaries. Limestone was hauled from distant quarries. Decorative elements were custom-made. Interiors were imported from Europe. Teams of craftsmen worked nearly without pause. The mansion was designed not just with bedrooms, but with grand reception halls, ballrooms, libraries, and spaces built to host the most exclusive gatherings of New York's elite. Every room communicated the same message: money, when applied with enough force, could recreate an entire social order. Once completed, the Charles Schwab Mansion quickly became a subject of conversation across the city. Newspapers described it as a European chateau rising in the middle of Manhattan, a sign that the Gilded Age had reached its peak of confidence, and perhaps its peak of excess. The parties held there were not simply social occasions. They were performances of soft power, where politicians, bankers, and industrialists met within a space carefully crafted by Schwab himself. Behind the lights and music, however, the cost of maintaining such a structure grew steadily heavier. Operating a mansion of this scale required constant and substantial income, something Schwab no longer controlled as securely after leaving United States Steel. He remained wealthy, but that wealth was increasingly tied to speculative investments and to the belief that markets would always favor those who had already won. The mansion, built as a declaration of personal power and permanence, slowly became an entity that demanded absolute financial obedience. Schwab, who had once directed vast industrial systems, now found himself serving the very symbol he had created. This was the first paradox and the earliest sign of a series of choices that would carry him further away from financial stability. In the next part, the story turns darker as economic shifts and personal decisions begin to erode Schwab's position, and the Manhattan Mansion, once a symbol of victory, gradually reveals itself as a burden that can no longer be concealed. Prolonged luxury and the quiet fractures beneath it. In the early years after the Charles Schwab Mansion was completed, the surface of things still appeared intact. The parties continued. Powerful guests still passed through the massive stone gates. Schwab's name was still spoken with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. To New York's upper society, the mansion seemed like an unassailable fortress of success, proof that certain men had risen beyond the ordinary limits of their age. But history rarely moves according to appearances, and the most consequential changes often begin in silence. After leaving United States Steel, Schwab no longer possessed a stable stream of income tied to a vast industrial structure. Instead, he turned to personal investments, speculative ventures, and financial relationships built more on reputation than on long-term foundations. For a time, this strategy appeared to work. Schwab's name, forged over decades, opened doors that would have remained closed to others. Yet that very ease gradually eroded his sense of caution. Schwab's lifestyle reflected an unshaken belief that he still stood at the summit. The Manhattan Mansion did not merely carry an immense construction cost. It demanded a continuous flow of money to sustain its staff, maintenance, and social events expected to match the stature of its owner. Schwab did not scale back. He expanded. Each gathering, each reception was staged as further evidence that his power had not diminished. At the same time, the broader American economy was beginning to shift. Financial markets grew more complex. Competition intensified. Volatility that had once affected only speculators now reached those long considered untouchable. Schwab, accustomed to guiding massive systems through instinct and personality, struggled to adapt to an environment that required patience, risk management, and acceptance of limits. The first signs of financial strain did not arrive as public scandal. They appeared in quieter forms: an increasing reliance on loans, the restructuring of assets, and short-term decisions made to preserve a long-term way of life. The mansion, once a symbol of personal freedom, became the center of a tightening financial spiral. Every stone wall, once meant to proclaim strength, now demanded continued payment, continued visibility, continued proof. Within high society, few are willing to admit decline, and Schwab, with his powerful temperament and deep pride, was no exception. He continued to appear in public. He continued to speak. He continued to be invoked as a symbol of the Gilded Age, even as the financial ground beneath him steadily eroded. The gap between public image and private reality widened, creating a dangerous distance that Schwab either could not, or would not, fully confront. In the next part, the story enters a phase where these fractures can no longer be hidden. Major economic upheavals, combined with years of accumulated personal decisions, will force Schwab to face the hardest choice of his life: whether to surrender the very symbol he built to define success and accept that even the most powerful individuals eventually encounter limits they cannot outrun, financial shockwaves, and an irreversible weakening. As the next decade unfolded, the world surrounding Charles Schwab no longer resembled the one he had mastered. America, once driven by near unchecked expansion, began to slow. Economic cycles that Schwab had previously navigated through personal authority and reputation grew harsher and far less forgiving. Financial markets became increasingly sensitive. Banks tightened credit, and trust, the invisible force that had long sustained industrial empires, grew fragile. For Schwab, these shifts did not arrive as a single thunderclap, but as a prolonged series of tremors. Investments once considered secure began to falter. Returns were no longer sufficient to offset the cost of maintaining his vast lifestyle and properties. The Manhattan Mansion, with its immense scale and excess, became the focal point of mounting financial pressure. Each passing year, its operating costs rose, while Schwab's ability to generate stable income continued to decline. The major economic disruptions of the early 20th century, particularly the cycles of recession before and after the First World War, exposed a widening divide. Those who controlled financial systems and credit survived. Those who had once commanded industrial production but now stood outside emerging power structures struggled. Schwab, shaped by a world where steel and output defined authority, found himself increasingly unprepared for an era governed by banking, markets, and monetary policy. Pressure came not only from the economy. Age, declining health, and decades of accumulated strain began to weigh on Schwab's judgment. Decisions once made with speed and certainty grew hesitant, defensive. Yet even in that hesitation, Schwab held firmly to a core belief that conditions would turn, that downturns were temporary, and that his personal reputation remained strong enough to restore his position. What he could no longer avoid was a deeper truth. The world he had conquered had changed its structure. Power no longer resided primarily in the hands of bold industrial leaders, but in institutions, boards, and tightly managed systems of risk. In that new order, Schwab's Manhattan Mansion, once a declaration of freedom and dominance, now resembled a relic of a passing age, magnificent, but increasingly misaligned with reality. Private negotiations with banks, quiet restructurings of debt, and incremental concessions became part of Schwab's daily life. These developments did not appear in headlines, but they steadily eroded both his financial footing and his sense of control. Each agreement offered delay rather than resolution, and with each delay, the cost of preserving the symbol grew heavier. In the next part, the story reaches a decisive stage, as Schwab is forced to confront the most difficult choice of his life, whether to relinquish the very symbol he created to define success, and accept that even those who once stood at the summit cannot outrun history forever. Letting go of the symbol, when the mansion no longer belonged to its creator. The moment Charles Schwab was forced to confront the reality that his Manhattan Mansion could no longer be sustained, did not arrive with thunder or public collapse. It came slowly, in the way the grandest symbols of the Gilded Age often unraveled, not through spectacle, but through quiet, private decisions heavy with consequence. For a man who had spent his life constructing an image of personal power, accepting the loss of the clearest symbol of that power proved as difficult as any financial setback. In the final years Schwab remained in the mansion, the atmosphere had changed. The parties grew fewer. Their scale diminished. Familiar faces from the highest circles of society appeared less often. The building still stood, immense and imposing, but it felt less like a living center of influence and more like a vast shell preserving echoes of a vanished past. With each passing season, the cost of taxes, upkeep, and debt attached to the property became harder to justify. Eventually, the decision to sell was no longer strategic. It was unavoidable. When the Charles Schwab Mansion passed out of its creator's hands, it marked more than a real estate transaction. It signaled the end of a personal era. The house, built to declare Schwab's permanence among America's ruling elite, entered an entirely different fate, becoming an asset to be transferred, repurposed, and ultimately erased from Manhattan's landscape. The mansion's later demolition reflected more than shifting urban needs. It revealed history's indifference to personal ambition. There was no ceremony, no formal farewell. Stone was dismantled. Space was subdivided. Manhattan moved forward without looking back. For the city, it was progress. For Schwab, it was the disappearance of a part of himself he had cast into architecture. After losing the mansion, Schwab's life contracted, both materially and socially. His name still appeared in books and recollections of the Gilded Age, but he no longer occupied the center of economic decision-making. In his final years, he lived more quietly, removed from the public display that had once defined him. Whatever wealth remained no longer took the form of power or influence, only enough to support a modest existence far removed from his former grandeur. What makes Schwab's story enduring is not simply that he once possessed great wealth and later lost it. It is that he placed nearly absolute faith in the idea that success could be made permanent through stone and money. His Manhattan mansion was the clearest expression of that belief. Its complete disappearance offered history's silent reply. Cities can absorb ambition, but they are under no obligation to preserve any individual dream. In the next part, the story moves toward the final chapter of Schwab's life, as he dies with little material wealth remaining, leaving behind a deeper lesson about the limits of personal power in a world that continues to reshape itself without pause. A quiet death and the truth behind a once brilliant legacy. As Charles Schwab entered the final years of his life, the distance between the man who once stood at the pinnacle of American industrial power and the man he had become could no longer be concealed. There were no more limestone halls, no glittering banquets, no closed-door meetings where decisions of national consequence were made. His world narrowed materially and socially. It was not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual withdrawal, as if history itself were gently guiding him away from the center of the stage. In these final years, Schwab lived more on reputation than on real authority. He was still invited to certain gatherings, still referenced as a defining figure of the Gilded Age, but his presence carried symbolism rather than influence. America had moved into a new phase, one dominated by boards, regulations, and tightly managed financial systems. The kind of leadership rooted in personal force and individual will, which had once elevated Schwab, had quietly fallen out of step with the times. When Charles Schwab died in 1939, the world around him was profoundly different. The United States had just endured the Great Depression, a catastrophe that erased fortunes, ambitions, and illusions once thought unbreakable. Against that backdrop, Schwab's death passed with little public shock. There was no national mourning, no grand speeches affirming him as a final victor. Instead, there was relative silence, an unspoken acknowledgement that he belonged to an era that had already closed. What startled later historians, and remains a frequently noted detail, was Schwab's financial condition at the time of his death. The man who had once controlled American steel, who had built one of the largest private mansions in Manhattan, left the world with only a modest personal fortune compared to the heights he had once commanded. This was not due to a lack of talent, but to an unwavering faith in the permanence of a model of success bound tightly to his era. Schwab's true legacy, therefore, lies not in stone, money, or vanished architecture. It lies in his story itself, a reflection of the Gilded Age at its most revealing, a time when immense wealth could be created with unprecedented speed, and just as swiftly undone when circumstances shifted. Schwab stands as living evidence that even the most extraordinary personal success cannot remain untouched by broader economic and social forces. The Manhattan Mansion, now surviving only in photographs and archival drawings, has become a perfect metaphor. It was built to challenge time, to secure a man's place permanently within the city. But cities do not remember in the way individuals hope. They move forward, absorbing and erasing, leaving behind not structures, but lessons. Charles Schwab's story is not simply a warning against excess or personal failure. It is a deeper reminder that economic power is always temporary, that symbols cannot replace durable foundations, and that even those who once stood at the summit cannot escape the cold rearrangement of history. In the quiet of this ending, Schwab leaves behind a legacy less dazzling, but more honest, a lesson about the limits of human ambition in a world that never stops changing. When history closes, But the city goes on. After Charles Schwab's death, there was no single moment that officially marked the end of his story. No final verdict was pronounced. No chapter was ceremonially closed. New York simply continued, as it always does, with busier streets, taller buildings, and new generations stepping into the same currents of ambition Schwab once embodied. In this case, history did not pause to remember. It quietly absorbed a man once considered indispensable and moved forward. What gives Schwab's story its lasting weight is not how wealthy he once was, but how deeply he believed success could be fixed in place, framed in stone, architecture, and personal image. His Manhattan mansion was the clearest attempt to turn a historical moment into something permanent. Yet its complete disappearance reveals a central paradox. Modern cities do not preserve personal ambition. They remember only what continues to serve their movement. Schwab was not alone in this belief. Many titans of the Gilded Age built palaces, estates, and symbols far beyond practical need. But Schwab stands apart because he represented not only wealth, but the conviction that personal force could outlast structural change. History answered that belief without drama. Personality may lift a man to great heights, but structure decides who remains there. To say Schwab died penniless should not be taken literally. He did not die destitute, nor was he cast aside by society. Yet measured against the power he once held, the contraction of his life was profound. It exposed the widening gap between industrial power and financial power, between the age of builders and the age of managers, a divide that few were able to cross. Today, the site where the Charles Schwab Mansion once stood is an unremarkable part of Manhattan. There is no marker, no plaque, no sign that one of the city's grandest private houses ever occupied that ground. Passers-by move through the space unaware of what once stood there, and it is precisely this absence that gives the story its strength. History is written not only by what remains, but by what disappears. Charles Schwab's life, then, is not merely a personal tragedy. It is a slice of American history, a moment when wealth, ambition, and belief in progress reached their height, only to confront the realities of economic cycles and social change. Schwab did not fail because he lacked ability. He failed because he lived fully within the logic of his time, and that time passed more quickly than he could adapt. As this documentary draws toward its close, what remains is not the image of a man who lost everything, but an open question directed at the present. In a world that still celebrates success and continues to build new symbols of power and wealth, what can be learned from a vanished mansion and a man who once believed it would last forever? History does not answer that question for us. It simply leaves the evidence behind, and the responsibility of interpretation belongs to those who come after. Epilogue: the symbol disappears, the lesson remains. When the final silence settles over Charles Schwab's story, what lingers is not the sound of collapse, but the steady rhythm of a city that never paused. New York did not remember Schwab in the way he might have hoped. It did not preserve his mansion as a permanent monument, nor did it retell his story through formal commemoration. Instead, the city remembered in its own way, by continuing to change, by building new structures atop old ground, as if each generation were free to redefine success for itself. Seen this way, Charles Schwab becomes a transitional figure. He stood at the boundary between two eras, one in which individual will and personality could shape entire industries, and another in which power dispersed into systems, procedures, and institutions larger than any single person. Schwab mastered the first era, but he did not fully reconfigure himself for the second. That failure was not moral. It was historical. If we look again at his Manhattan mansion, we can see it as an attempt to freeze time. The French Renaissance architecture, the vast halls, the deliberate excess, all expressed a belief that power, once achieved, could be preserved through physical form. But urban history does not operate on nostalgia. It favors function, density, and adaptability. What no longer serves that movement is replaced, no matter how magnificent it once appeared. Schwab's story reaches beyond one man's rise and fall. It raises a deeper question about the relationship between personal success and social structure. When success rests heavily on a single individual, it can grow quickly and brilliantly. But as the world becomes more complex, that same concentration becomes a vulnerability. Schwab did not fail because he was incapable, but because he was perfectly suited to an era that had already begun to pass. In the present, as new symbols of wealth and power continue to rise, this story remains strikingly relevant. Skyscrapers, personal brands, empires bearing the names of their founders, all carry the same underlying question. What will remain when conditions change? What will the city keep, and what will history quietly remove? Charles Schwab left behind little that still stands, but it is precisely that absence which gives his story its endurance. It survives not as a monument, but as a lesson, a reminder that success must not only be created, but placed within a structure capable of lasting longer than the individual who creates it. As this documentary concludes, the viewer is not invited to mourn or to judge Charles Schwab. Instead, they are invited to observe, to compare, and to ask. In a world still busy constructing new symbols of power every day, are we building legacies for the future, or merely erecting brilliant moments waiting to be replaced? History does not answer that question for us. It only leaves stories like this one behind, clear enough to illuminate, and quiet enough for each generation to draw its own conclusions. The final word when ambition settles and history speaks. As this story reaches its final moments, what stands out is not how much money Charles Schwab lost, nor the fact that the mansion he built was ultimately torn down. What endures is the familiar feeling the story leaves behind. Because Schwab was not a rare anomaly in history. He was a pattern, one that has repeated under different names, in different eras, and in different cities. Charles Schwab believed in the power of individual will. He believed that if a person were bold enough, decisive enough, and confident enough, reality itself could be bent to serve that vision. For a certain moment in American history, that belief was justified. It built steel mills, bridges, railroads, factories, and an entire modern economy. But history does not remain loyal to a single logic. As systems grow larger and risks spread beyond individuals, power inevitably shifts away from singular figures and into invisible structures, banks, boards, regulations, and mechanisms of control. Schwab did not betray his era. He remained faithful to it until the very end, and that fidelity is what gives his story its quiet tragedy. He did not fail through reckless error. He was simply one step behind history, and in the realms of economics and power, being one step behind is enough to be left behind entirely. Today, when we look at the remaining black and white photographs of the Charles Schwab Mansion, we no longer see the overwhelming luxury that once stunned his contemporaries. What appears more clearly now is an effort to hold on to a position in an order already slipping away. A man attempting to carve his name into a city that had begun writing a different chapter. If Charles Schwab left behind any true legacy, it is not found in physical structures. It exists in the question his life forces us to confront. What does success mean when context changes? How much value does a symbol hold if it cannot adapt? And whether we are building for the future or merely constructing monuments to our present moment, this documentary does not end with a verdict. History rarely does. It simply places events side by side and allows the viewer to feel the weight of time, choice, and human limitation. Charles Schwab was not a failure. He was proof that even the greatest winners cannot win forever against the current of history. And as the screen fades to black, as the story closes in the familiar silence of New York, what remains may not be the image of a vanished mansion, but a quiet thought carried by the viewer that in every era, new Charles Schwabs are being born, and history, as always, waits patiently to see who will adapt and who will be left behind, the echo of an era when the story continues beyond the ending. After the narration falls silent, history does not end with the closing frame. It continues in the way cities are built, in how power is organized, and in how people imagine their own futures. Charles Schwab's story, therefore, does not conclude with his death, nor does it end at the empty ground where his Manhattan mansion once stood. It lingers quietly within the choices that later generations continue to make, often without realizing how familiar those choices are. In every era, there are individuals who believe they can outpace the cycle, that their success is not merely a product of circumstance, but proof of something permanent within themselves. Schwab believed this, and for a time, history seemed to agree with him. But history does not remain loyal to belief. It remains loyal to change. When structures shift, those who cannot shift with them are left behind, not because they were wrong, but because they arrived too early or stayed too long. At its core, this story is not only about money or architecture. It is about the psychology of power, about the moment when individuals begin to believe that personal symbols can substitute for systems, that monuments can endure longer than the conditions that produced them. Schwab's mansion stood as the purest expression of that belief. Its complete disappearance became time's answer, delivered without commentary. Today, new symbols continue to rise. Taller buildings, larger empires, names tied to success in ways strikingly similar to Schwab's own era. But the lesson history offers is not found in comparison of scale or wealth. It lies in a more fundamental question. Which of these symbols can survive when context changes? Which are flexible enough not to become burdens to those who create them? This epilogue is not meant to close the story, but to reopen it, because every viewer lives in a time with its own mansions, perhaps not of stone, but of personal brands, digital wealth, and invisible forms of influence. And like Charles Schwab once did, every generation believes its symbols will endure longer than those that came before. History does not challenge that belief. It observes, patiently, and waits to see who adapts, and who becomes another story told in silence. This documentary ends here, not as a loud warning, but as a necessary pause, a slower breath, allowing the viewer to carry the story beyond the screen, beyond New York, and into the present moment. Because history does not exist only behind us. It is being written every day, through choices that often feel ordinary, and therefore, familiar. The vanished mansions and their shadows in New York's history. When Charles Schwab's story is placed within a broader frame, it becomes clear that his mansion was not alone among the great structures built to assert personal power, only to vanish without a trace. New York, especially during the transition from the 19th to the early 20th century, was a city of bold experiments. It allowed ambition to erupt at extraordinary speed, but it was equally willing to erase what no longer aligned with its evolving rhythm. In that process, many grand mansions rose and disappeared, leaving behind gaps that only history can now fill. Other tycoons of Schwab's era also believed architecture could serve as a form of insurance for reputation. The private palaces along Fifth Avenue, the summer cottages of Newport, and the vast estates on the edges of New York were all built according to the same logic. They were not merely places to live, but declarations that their owners had escaped the temporary cycles of the market. Yet as economic structures shifted and land values rose, these buildings increasingly came to be seen as inefficient uses of space, relics of an outdated way of thinking. What makes Schwab's mansion especially representative is not that it was the largest or the most expensive, but that it stood in the heart of Manhattan, where change moves faster and with less mercy. There, architectural memory is not preserved through reverence, but through utility. Any structure, no matter how historically meaningful, that no longer fits the city's needs is eventually replaced, and that replacement usually occurs quietly, without justification. When urban historians look back at these vanished mansions, they do not view them simply as losses. Instead, they see them as evidence of a city that consistently privileges the future over the past. The buildings that were torn down became foundations for new generations, new forms of living, and new definitions of success and power. In this context, Schwab was not a victim of history, but part of the city's relentless, consistent logic. When Schwab is compared to other tycoons of his time, a common pattern emerges. Many achieved personal success on an unprecedented scale, yet few created structures flexible enough to survive beyond their own era. Those remembered most enduringly were not always the ones who built the biggest, but those whose influence blended into systems rather than standing apart as isolated symbols. This part of the story does not seek to deepen Schwab's tragedy, but to place it within a broader historical rule. New York does not resist ambition. It encourages it. But it does not promise permanence to any symbol. The city offers only one certainty: if a mark wishes to endure, it must continually prove its value in the present. In the next part, the story turns back toward the viewer, posing a more direct question. When we look at the symbols of wealth and power in our own time, are we witnessing the birth of lasting legacies, or are we standing before new Schwab mansions, waiting for history to decide their fate, a mirror for the present when new Schwab mansions are being built? If Charles Schwab were living in today's world, he likely would not build a limestone mansion overlooking the Hudson River. He might build a technology empire, a global personal brand, or an invisible symbol of power embedded in financial markets. But the core of the story would likely remain the same. Because what shaped Schwab's historical tragedy was not the form of the symbol, but the belief that the success of one era could be carried intact into the next. In the 21st century, we continue to witness new symbols rising at breathtaking speed. Taller glass towers, corporations bearing the names of their founders, individuals framed as irreplaceable. Every era believes it has learned from the past, yet history suggests that people rarely abandon the conviction that this time will be different. Schwab believed the same, and for many years, the world seemed to prove him right. The difference today lies in speed. What once took decades to build and decades to unravel can now occur within a few years, sometimes within months. Power no longer depends solely on physical assets, but on market confidence, algorithms, and complex systems that extend far beyond the control of any single individual. In this context, the lesson of Charles Schwab grows sharper, not obsolete. The question history poses is not whether ambition should exist. Ambition is a natural engine of progress. The question is whether the symbols ambition creates are built on foundations flexible enough to change with the world. Schwab built a symbol too tightly bound to his personal image and to a specific economic model. When that model collapsed, the symbol had nowhere left to stand. In the present, the line between legacy and liability is thinner than ever. A single decision to expand, a gesture of excess, or the belief that something is too big to fail can quickly become a point of weakness. What Schwab failed to do was not to accumulate more wealth, but to reconfigure his definition of success for a new order already taking shape. This reflection is not meant as a moral warning, nor as an argument for pessimism. It simply reminds us that history does not oppose success. History tests adaptability. Those who understand this early do not need to build monuments to prove permanence. They build structures capable of changing, even disappearing, without taking their creators down with them. In the next part, the story turns toward its final human question. After all the power, wealth, and symbols have passed, what truly remains with a person once history has moved on? And whether Charles Schwab found any answer to that question in the last years of his life, the man behind the symbol, the final years and private silence. As everything that once defined Charles Schwab in the public eye gradually fell away, what remained was no longer an industrialist, a tycoon, or a symbol of the Gilded Age. What remained was a man, and it was in this period, when the spotlight of history had moved on, that Schwab's truest portrait began to emerge. The final years of Schwab's life were not marked by dramatic collapse. There was no spectacular downfall, no public disgrace. There was only contraction. His living space contracted. His social world contracted. His influence contracted. A man once accustomed to entering rooms and reshaping them now became a quiet observer of a world that no longer revolved around him. And it was this transition, more than any financial loss, that proved the greatest challenge. Schwab still carried memory. He remembered clearly the years when his words could move markets, when decisions made in closed rooms shaped the lives of hundreds of thousands. But memory no longer carried power. It only invited comparison between what had been and what was, between the center and the margins. For many, such comparison is unbearable. Yet Schwab, according to contemporary accounts, gradually accepted it, not through philosophical awakening, but through the exhaustion of a man who had lived too fast, too high, for too long. In these years, Schwab spoke less about success and made fewer attempts to justify his past. There is no evidence of public regret, but neither is there the pride that once convinced him he could outrun any cycle. In its place was a quiet acknowledgement that there are things a person can control for a time, but never indefinitely. That power, like reputation, is not a permanent condition, but a historical role that is granted and then withdrawn. Notably, Schwab made no attempt to reconstruct his public image in his final years. He did not write lengthy defenses. He did not pursue a late return. His silence was not a strategy. It was the sign of a man who understood that his story, at least at the level of history, had already been written. What remained did not need to be spoken more loudly. In that silence, Schwab becomes closer to the viewer today, not as a distant tycoon, but as a human being facing what cannot be avoided. Time, replacement, and the reality that no one, no matter how high they once stood, can remain the central figure in the world's story forever. This part of the documentary does not romanticize decline, nor does it turn Schwab into a moral lesson. It pauses instead at the moment when a person meets the limits of himself. And in that moment, Charles Schwab is no longer a symbol of American industrial ambition, but a man who has completed a full historical cycle, from ascent to dominance to quiet withdrawal. In the next part, the story moves toward its final connection, where the individual and history fully converge. Not to end the story, but to answer one final question. After power fades, what is a life ultimately measured by? What remains? How a life is measured after power is gone? When history steps away from a person, When a name is no longer spoken in rooms of influence and authority no longer radiates outward, a final question inevitably emerges, even if no one voices it aloud. After everything, how is a life measured? For Charles Schwab, this question did not arrive as a sudden revelation. It emerged gradually, alongside the shrinking of his physical world, his social role, and the expectations once placed upon him. Measured by the standards that once elevated Schwab to the summit, power, wealth, scale, his final years appear diminished. But history rarely judges a life solely by the metrics of the era it once dominated. Seen from sufficient distance, the value of a life lies not in where it ends, but in what it reveals about the time that produced it. Schwab was a clear embodiment of an America that believed deeply in the boundless capacity of the individual. He did not merely live within that belief, he turned it into reality, at least for a time. Millions of tons of steel were produced. Thousands of miles of rail were laid. Modern cities rose. Those achievements did not vanish with the demolition of his Manhattan mansion. They became part of the invisible foundation of the modern world, even as Schwab's name faded from everyday memory. At that level, Schwab's value cannot be measured by the balance of his bank account at the time of his death, but by the intangible mark he and his generation left behind. Yet it is precisely here that the limits of the story become clear. A person may help create a new world, but cannot control how that world continues to operate after they are gone. Schwab helped build the American industrial age, but he no longer fit within the global, managerial order that followed. In his final years, free from the need to prove himself to the public, Schwab encountered a form of freedom he had never known before. There was no pressure to expand, no demand to display, no race left to win. This freedom was not glamorous, but it allowed a person to exist without performance. And within that existence, value was no longer measured by outward impact, but by the ability to accept one's place within the flow of time. This part of the story does not suggest that Schwab reached a moral or philosophical awakening. History rarely grants such clarity. What it does reveal is something subtler, that even those who once lived by the greatest ambitions must eventually confront the same question faced by everyone. Who are we when we are no longer defined by our roles? In the final part of this documentary, the story will place Charles Schwab back into his proper position in history. Neither elevated nor diminished. Simply a man who lived fully within his era, and who left behind not a monument, but a mirror for reflection. A final place in history, no monument, no myth. As this story reaches its conclusion, the task is not to elevate Charles Schwab into legend, nor to reduce him to a cautionary tale. History rarely works in such absolutes. Instead, it places individuals where they belong within the long current of time, where both their triumphs and their limits become visible when viewed from a sufficient distance. Charles Schwab was neither the richest nor the most powerful figure America ever produced, but he was among the clearest expressions of the spirit of the Gilded Age, a period that believed individual ambition could expand without limit. That progress did not need to ask history for permission. Schwab lived fully within that belief, pushed it to its furthest reach, and encountered its boundary when the context around him shifted. If Schwab is remembered today, it is not because his Manhattan mansion once stood, for that structure has vanished entirely from the city's landscape. Nor is it because of the wealth he possessed at the end of his life, for that figure fails to capture the scale of influence he once commanded. He is remembered as a historical example, a case that shows how one person can be both an architect of an era and a casualty of the very logic that defined it. In that position, Schwab requires no monument. He needs no rehabilitation of reputation. His story stands on its own because it reflects a recurring pattern in modern history. When power concentrates in individuals, it can generate extraordinary momentum, but as systems grow more complex, that same concentration becomes the most fragile point of all. What makes this final chapter matter is not the closing of a life, but the closing of a particular understanding of success. Charles Schwab believed success needed to be seen, built, and anchored in physical space. History offered a different conclusion. Success may help shape the future, but those who create it do not control how they are remembered. As this documentary ends, the viewer is not guided toward a single emotion, not admiration, not pity. Instead, there is space for reflection, where Schwab's story merges with larger questions about ambition, power, and replacement. In that quiet space, history does not speak. It simply stands still long enough for us to look. Charles Schwab lived faithfully within his era, and for that reason, his story remains meaningful to those who come after. Not as advice, but as historical truth. That no symbol is permanent. No success is independent of context. And no individual, no matter how high they once stood, can stand outside the laws of time and change. A quiet invitation, the story does not end here. As Charles Schwab's story comes to rest, there is no final crescendo, no swelling music, no forced conclusion. Only a silence long enough to realize that this story, in some way, does not belong entirely to the past. What happened to Schwab was not an isolated episode in history. It was a pattern, a cycle, one that continues to repeat itself under different names, in different forms, across different eras. New symbols are still being built. New mansions, no longer of stone, but of influence, reputation, and belief that today's success can last forever. If you have stayed until these final moments, perhaps you were not only watching a historical account. Perhaps you were comparing it, quietly, to the world you live in now. To how success is defined, to the symbols that command trust today, and to the unspoken question that inevitably follows. What of this will remain when circumstances change? If this story offered you a pause, a slower thought in the middle of a fast-moving world, you may choose to leave a comment. Not to analyze, not to conclude. Just to mark that you were here, that you listened, and that you carried this story beyond the screen. And if you are drawn to more historical stories like this, stories that do not simply recount the past, but reflect it back onto the present, consider following the channel. Not for answers, but for the space to keep asking questions together. Because history does not end when a video stops playing. It only grows quiet. And somewhere in some era, another Charles Schwab may already be beginning to build a symbol of his own.